rule's an ass, Mr. Cook. I've been swindled and I can't get my money back.
Well, we've had more than 100 complaints.
Yeah. How about a shot of that document? Okay, run camera.
That's him. He's the director of all 6 companies.
So where's all the money gone?
I haven't anything to say. Why not?
Checkpoint.
Motorcycle racing is a thrilling and spectacular sport. It's also potentially very dangerous. On the Isle of Man TT course alone, 112 competitors have been killed since the war. Over the same period in professional boxing, a sport many would like to see banned in Britain, there have been only 10 deaths. Few would like to see motorcycle racing banned, but many now question whether the number of people killed and maimed need be so tragically high. This is a big money business, and the sometimes conflicting demands of promoters, spectators and riders obviously need regulating. The body which organises the sport in Britain is the Autocycle Union, the ACU, which runs all the major races, including this, the British Grand Prix. Chairman of the Road Racing Committee with specific responsibility for tarmac events is ACU veteran Vernon Cooper. Riders have charged that the Road Racing Committee and its officials have a record of costly failure. Failure to stop races in dangerous conditions, failure to deal with dangerous road surfaces, failure to remove or protect roadside hazards, failure to hold effective inquiries, and failure to halt races after serious accidents.
Well, I've been world champion 3 times, and the ACU is the least safety-conscious organization that I've ever seen. I think, and I've said before, that that's why that the young riders do not come out of England so much, is because that they get hurt or killed on unsafe racetracks while they're trying to learn.
Vernon Cooper proudly claims to have saved the Isle of Man TT and to have preserved it from any major changes, so it remains one of the most controversial circuits in the world. Nevertheless, Mr. Cooper continues to insist that as riders know all the risks, their safety is in their own hands, as he told another BBC programme earlier this year.
It is as safe as the driver makes it, and most drivers, well, in fact, I would say all drivers racing in the Isle of Man would race at 95% of their maximum capabilities, where at a Grand Prix they tend to go over their capabilities.
Now, some riders say they won't come here. Some of the top riders, they think it's dangerous.
They think they can't win.
14 of those who did race are buried in the graveyard opposite the start line. Defenders of the TT maintain that its critics have never been man enough to ride in it. Well, Clive Horton did, and he won.
There's probably hardly an inch around this racetrack that's not caused somebody some kind of pretty perilous incident sometime in their racing career. And if not killed them, there's quite a few, really.
Well, some of them over the road there, in the cemetery.
Well, I've actually never paid a visit around the cemetery, and I don't think I would, really. It's the Battle of Britain attitude, really. You know, the pilots will do the job, and so will the riders. They'll go out, and if you lose one, you can always find another one. There's another one ready to take his place.
Well, bearing in mind this sort of Battle of Britain mentality, as you call it, shouldn't the ACU, your organisation, be doing more to look after its own?
Yeah, I suppose the organisation does consider the riders, well, with less feeling than a golfer gives a lost golf ball. I mean, I play both sports. I've done both sports, and you will supply more interest in a lost golf ball than our organisation seems to do in a lost rider, whether he's a brain damaged or a broken back in a wheelchair or dead, really. And to me, it's a bit sad and a bit unfortunate. And I do think the riders are valuable people, brilliant people, really. I'm mixing with them all the time, and they're worth looking after.
Under this stretch of relatively new tarmac here, there used to be a manhole cover, and before the 1978 TT, a number of riders, feeling it was dangerous, in fact proving it was by skidding when they hit it, asked the Autocycle Union to have it removed. The Autocycle Union didn't do so, didn't get the authorities to do so either, but the one concession they did make was to paint a yellow line down the hill so as they came down, the riders could try and miss the manhole cover. The race started, and Kenny Birch and Mac Hobson didn't miss the manhole cover. They hit it, became airborne. They were both killed. Indeed, one of them was actually cut in half. And seconds later, a Swiss rider, also whizzing down this hill, went through the debris, crashed down the hill, and was also killed. But the race went on.
It's the determination to carry on racing at all costs that most worries Clive Horton. He led me on a two-wheel tour of the TT course.
The problems with the TT, really, are the closeness of the hazards to the racing surface. It's the proximity of the trees and the stone walls and that kind of thing. You could make it safe. It'd take a fair while and about 3 bulldozers, and they'd dig a trench about 30 feet wide each side of the racetrack, and then it becomes safe.
Clive chose to highlight the sometimes hidden hazards of Laurel Bank. At least 6 competitors have died here. Behind the greenery on the left is a wall of solid rock, and then on the right, on the outside of this left-hand bend, there are curbstones and a steep drop. The wall on the right there is topped with barbed wire, and you have to watch out for the embankment on the left. Then round the bend on the right are unprotected trees and telegraph poles and randomly protected stone walls.
If you crash here, the punishment does not fit the crime. You've made a mistake and you get punished fairly severely. John McEnroe, for instance, if he makes a mistake in tennis, he knocks the ball into the wrong square that you're supposed to knock it into. He doesn't die because of that. He just loses points.
This is the site of the most recent death on the TT course, that of Jimmy Miller, who died during our stay on the island.
See the straw bales down there? The guy hit the curb then missed the straw bales and hit the wall.
So when riders like you go to the powers that be and complain about things like that, what sort of reception do you get?
Well, my experience twice, really, it's fallen on relatively stony ground. You know, a bit like trying to dry yourself with a plastic bag. Might as well not bother.
You're saying there's no one to look after them, but surely that's what the ACU is for.
Yeah, but they don't.
Racing motorcycles is dangerous, like any type of speed sport, but I think we can make it as exciting for the people and as safe as possible. I mean, we have a kind of a balance. Safety is just something that and they tend to cover it up all the time, that they think they're safe, but they're not safe.
This is Alton Park, Vernon Cooper's home circuit. It's in his backyard, if you like. So it's sad to note just how many complaints there have been about track safety and about the way motorcycle racing is run here. There have been complaints about the surface breaking up at the edges. There have been complaints about puddles on the surface when races were due to start. There have been complaints about railway sleepers close to the perimeter. And there have been some pretty nasty incidents too. In 1979, for example, Dave Powell, a last-minute partner in a sidecar race, during practice came off after an accident and hit the grass, which would have been all right, except that concealed in that grass was a chunk of metal, probably the foundations of an old marshal's post. A marshal rushed to his aid and tried twice, by ringing control, to have the practice stopped. It wasn't vital anyway, it wasn't a proper race. But Dave Powell died in his arms before the ambulance could get to him. And there's been worse.
In 1981, Dave Potter was fatally injured in yet another controversial incident. His widow, Sue, still doesn't really know why, but will never forget the dreadful day.
I was just giving the children their tea, listening to the tannoy, and all of a sudden David's name didn't turn up anymore, and he'd been in the lead. And I ran through the crowds. As you can imagine, any accident at all at a circuit, there's lots of people congregate outside, so I had to push my way through. And when we got to the hospital, 4 doctors in turn came and told me that as far as they were concerned in their particular field, they didn't expect David to live any more than half an hour. So I rang everybody in the family. I organised my parents to come for the children. I had to go back to the circuit then, make sure that all the children's clothes were together, and get ready to hand them over to my parents.
Well, I knew and respected Dave Potter very well. He was a very good rider and a very likeable personality. The day that he had this crash, he was competing very closely with our own rider, Ron Haslam. And as both riders passed me on the circuit, I was watching very carefully. Just as they went past, Dave Potter began to lose control of his machine and slammed straight into the Armco barrier, which was completely unprotected at that point. Within a few seconds, an ambulance arrived and took Dave Potter away, and immediately the ambulance left. Straw bales were then produced from behind the Armco barrier and placed in front by the marshals who were responsible for that section of track.
What happened after that?
I returned to the pits. As an eyewitness, I was interviewed by the press and obviously said what I'd seen. I was in the company of two other experts, our own chassis designer and a man who was then our chief mechanic, so we'd all witnessed this. But subsequently, it was claimed in the press by the officials responsible for the circuit that the barrier had been protected all the time, which is certainly not the case. I mean, it was very much an attempt to whitewash the problem.
And the man responsible at that circuit at that time was Vernon Cooper?
Well, certainly he was the clerk of the course and responsible for the entire meeting and the safety.
Had there not been so many cover-ups at the time, and had I'd been in possession of the full facts and also the safety standards operating on that day, I may well have delved further into it. But even at the inquest, it wasn't terribly clear, or it was suppressed what had caused David's actual death.
I was quite shocked that the inquest occurred very quickly. I wasn't invited to the inquest, although I was a prominent eyewitness. And it was some weeks later, in fact, that a photograph appeared in one of the newspapers which confirmed, without any doubt, that the barrier had been unprotected.
Following another fatality at Oulton Park, riders themselves took the unprecedented step of walking out. During the 1000cc sidecar race, oil was dumped on the track and, according to eyewitnesses, just left there.
Well, it was the first 350 final of the day, and there was oil glistening on the track. And they started the race off, and after the first bend, there was a crash involving about 6 to 8 bikes, and there was Rodney North from South Africa got killed. And after that, the bikes come round and they pulled in on the first lap. They pulled back into the pits.
Without any red flag or anything. They pulled in of their own accord.
Yeah.
They didn't know there'd been an accident. And they pulled in of their own accord and pointed out point blank that the track wasn't fit to race on. They decided to pull out. Vernon Cooper, a few minutes later, he came out of his office and he said, "Why won't they race?
They're racing.
Well, what's wrong? What's wrong with them racing?
What's going on?"
And the track was absolutely not fit to race on. They decided of their own accord.
The leading group of riders were saying that they had wheel spin all around the track. It was
Even
treacherous.
in a straight line.
Treacherous.
It is possible to have a relatively safe accident, claims Dr. Rob Gray, a world authority on trackside medicine. He cites as evidence a dramatic superbike crash at Brands Hatch.
I was actually at the site of the accident, and the first rider falls there and he takes off. I think there were 16 others, but the important point to make here is that there was a good runoff. In fact, it's been widened since, and there was adequate protection of the barriers behind by the straw bales. And in that accident, there was only one really serious injury, and as far as I remember, the rest of the riders continued, and when the race was restarted, and were able to race in the same race later on in the afternoon.
You were saying that, to the best of your memory, there were 16 riders involved in that pile-up. Now, had they been unlucky enough to be seriously injured, with the ACU rulebook saying you only need one doctor, could that doctor possibly have coped?
I don't think that there's any way that adequate treatment can be given to seriously injured riders, certainly in that number, or even in much lesser numbers when there's just one doctor on the circuit.
Well, even presuming there are enough doctors, what sort of pressures are they working under when they're trying to help seriously injured people?
Well, I think there's always a pressure to get the rider off the track as quickly as possible, to get him out of sight of the crowd, out of sight of the organisers, even out of sight of the doctor if he's bundled off to hospital, because this makes it neat and tidy and easy, and then the race meeting can go on without any problems.
Well, surely in some circumstances that's quite the wrong thing to do.
Yes, I think it's entirely the wrong thing to do. I think that the time that's taken to get a rider from the track to hospital is very rarely under half an hour. And there's no one that would disagree who's dealt in emergency medicine that the first half hour is absolutely vital to the seriously injured person. And the treatment in that first half hour is often what determines whether this man is going to survive or whether he is going to die.
So the out of sight, out of mind attitude could actually kill people?
Yes, I think so.
America's Kenny Roberts, #1, followed here by Britain's Barry Sheene, #7, were long-time World Championship rivals who didn't agree on anything much, but they do agree about the ACU.
Well, I've always said about the ACU that the sport's got where it has in spite of and not because of the ACU. I've always had a running battle with Vernon Cooper ever since my early days of racing, really. If it comes to something that he's not in favour of, then I would say the chances of it being done, accomplished, would be minimal. Vernon Cooper has always been very much a TT man, and nobody can say anything about the TT. You know, the classic quote from Vernon Cooper was, "The throttle goes both ways." It's all very well to say it goes both ways, but if you have anything happen, any mechanical sort of failure, for example, like I had in America years ago, a tyre blew out 180 mile an hour. Then in the Isle of Man, you've got to be William Tell to hit one of the straw bales there. I mean, you can go around a corner and there'll be a bloody great big stone wall on one corner with no protection. You go around the next corner, it's smothered in sandbags. I mean, there's no rhyme nor reason to it.
Barry Sheene's no fan of the TT or Mr. Cooper's committee either. When they didn't nominate him for an extra term on the international governing body, the FIM, they claimed that he didn't always represent the riders' best interests. However, Barry Sheene suspects, rightly or wrongly, that his campaign against the TT was also a consideration.
I was about as welcome as a fart in a spacesuit. I just happened to see a telex going to the press in England saying that Barry Sheene's name wasn't put forward as a rider's representative. So I buttonholed Cooper about it, and he said, no, that wasn't me. That was the ACU committee that did that.
I remember years ago, my first GP in England, it was at Silverstone, and a cloud burst on like the 4th lap. And we were going down the back straight, hitting puddles of water with slicks on. We were doing probably 160, 70 miles an hour. And the bike would dart across this way and hit another, the Silverstone puddles up, and it hit another puddle and dart across this way. And they never stopped the race.
Kenny, what have you got to say? I don't know. I'm riding a motorcycle. I don't know who won it. I can't even see where in the hell I'm going. I think the goddamn race should have been stopped, and everybody put on rain tires and go again.
Vernon Cooper's in charge of the ACU, and he is the person that you absolutely know when you go to anything with him about safety, he's going to say no. For example, the other year at Silverstone, we, as a rider's representative, we have a guy that the riders pay to do this stuff because we're busy racing. Months in advance, phone the ACU and request straw bales be put up at the race instead of the catch fence, because the catch fencing at Silverstone was not legal in their rule books anyway. You couldn't knock them over, which is what you're supposed to do with catch fences. A truck couldn't have knocked them over, much less a rider. So we were told, and it went all the way up to Vernon Cooper, and Vernon Cooper said no. Well, I showed up, and I knew it was going to be a fight. I showed up at the race, me and two other American riders, and we were there a week early, and we went to the circuit to inspect it. And as we knew, there was no straw bales. And the owner of the circuit came out to help us. And he said, after looking at the situation out there with us, he said, "You're right." He said, "I realize that you guys need hay bales. I'm happy to put up hay bales. I'm only worried that the ACU will not give me a sanction next year to run the race."
Although Mr. Cooper claimed that additional straw bales could breach international regulations, when faced with the threat of a strike by top riders, the disputed protective bales were provided immediately. It was also at Silverstone that criticism of the way the ACU organises races reached a peak in the aftermath of a crash which killed Norman Brown and Peter Huber last year. A representative of the top riders was with Vernon Cooper at the time of the accident and during the events that followed. The ACU had accused riders of failing to heed flag signals after the accident. Mike Trimby came to tell us what he'd seen.
But if you look at the evidence of the video film of the event, you can see what really happened.
And there's been a very serious accident down at Stowe Corner involving some of the back markers. It looks as the race may well be stopped. We've got...
Now these are the leading riders approaching the accident site. Now, as you can see, there are no cross flags out at this stage, so they don't know that the race is supposed to be stopped. The cross flags would indicate the race being stopped prematurely. Now, these are the riders further down the field, and as they go around the same corner, you can now see the cross flags being put out. So these guys, Spencer, Roberts and Mamela, leading the race, do not know that the race has been stopped. In theory, the race is only stopped by having a red flag at the start line, which isn't there. And you'll see when they go around this corner that there's a green flag out in the top of the picture showing that the track is clear. These guys have seen the cross flags at the site of the accident. They come round, no red flag at the start line. So what do? Do they go into the pits? Do they carry on racing? Absolute chaos.
But no red flag here.
Now we have a situation where Kenny Roberts and the leading riders will now have passed these cross flags and be coming back round to the start line. First time they've seen them, coming round to the start line, looking for the red flag. And you can see Kenny's reaction to not getting it. That's at the clerk of the course, Vernon Cooper. Still no one taking any decision.
Why don't they stop the race? There is a body lying on the track down at...
Still counting down the laps of the race.
And still no red flag here.
And only now, 2.5 laps after the incident, do they actually put the red flag out.
So you were there. How did that come about?
I was stood, in fact, with Cooper at the back. Cooper did not know what was going on. He was not aware that an accident had happened. Somewhere there was a breakdown in communication between the people on the site who, in the rider's opinion, very correctly and very courageously tried to stop the race, and the only person who, in the rules of the governing body of the sport, has permission to stop the race was the clerk of the course, Vernon Cooper. And that communication broke down. What we objected to was that he chose to criticise riders for not stopping, when in fact the whole confusion was caused by his indecision.
But in private, Mr. Cooper is anything but indecisive, according to Derek Jackson, who now runs a bicycle shop, but was previously secretary to the ACU Road Racing Committee for 13 years. Mr. Cooper's insistence on getting his own way was something Mr. Jackson didn't like, but as a paid official, he says, he had to get used to it.
There were a number of occasions, I can't be specific, but I can remember that because no show of hands was taken, I would record it as an item in which nothing was agreed, whereas the chairman, being the last person to speak, and that's Vernon Cooper, would correct me and say that as he was the last person to speak, nobody objected, then that must have been the decision. I worked there and I had to keep my mouth shut for an awful lot of things which I didn't particularly like, but I was paid as an official and I wasn't an elected member. I had to honour the code of keeping mum when it was required.
So he got what he wanted, but was what he wanted always the right thing for the ACU and the riders?
I don't know. I think at times that riders didn't come into it, really. It was a matter
But surely the ACU is a body that's supposed to be looking after them.
Yes, but Vernon once accused me of being far too close to the riders. He said my problem basically is I'm too close to the riders and I'm too highly influenced by them when I was querying something with him.
As it became known that we were investigating riders' complaints about safety, we began to receive unsolicited phone calls from witnesses to a number of other tragic incidents and from people simply worried about what they said was the autocratic and uncaring way their sport was being run. Since the war, the death toll has topped 300. There was also an unsolicited and ill-informed hullabaloo in the motorcycling press, during which the BBC was accused of starting a witch hunt for Vernon Cooper. We were told by Mr. Cooper via one of these newspapers that the BBC was having second thoughts about the entire film. And though he'd been invited to appear, he later went on record as demanding an interview. And this was followed by an editorial in Motorcycling Weekly which declared the very fact that he's prepared to be interviewed and filmed before the programme has probably upset the producers, who thrive on confrontation. If Checkpoint screens that programme, Mr. Cooper apparently told Motorcycling News, "I want to be in it." I asked for a week's notice, and I would require some idea of what they were talking about in order to do the relevant research. Well, in fact, he's had 2 weeks' notice and questions in writing as well. "I want to be in the programme," he repeated, "but I suspect they'll put up some smart-aleck interviewer who's only trying to trip you up. Whatever's in the programme won't be to the benefit of the sport or the ACU," he added, and concluded by saying, "The BBC are the scum of the earth, and you can quote me on that." Having arranged an interview at his Cheshire home, Mr. Cooper had his solicitor ring us the afternoon before to tell us the interview was off. He gave 2 contradictory reasons: that there'd been a lot of sensational publicity and that our investigations had been kept secret. In fact, the publicity was generated elsewhere, and as for the alleged secrecy, well, Mr. Cooper had all our questions in writing long ago. Since we're not suggesting Mr. Cooper has committed any offence, and since his energy and determination on behalf of the ACU were legendary, we made another effort to get his side of the story. A flicker of curtains was followed by the appearance of Mrs. Cooper from a side door.
My name's Roger Cook.
She insisted that her husband wasn't in, despite the presence of his personally registered Jaguar, and said that she had called the police.
That's right.
Yes.
And I'd like to speak to Mr. Cooper, please. Why can't I speak to your husband?
She made it obvious that her husband's refusal to be interviewed was irreversible. When she turned her back and went inside, I left as asked.
Good morning. There isn't a problem. We came to do an interview with Mr. Cooper, who had demanded an interview in the press to discuss some of the allegations that are made about his running of the Autocycle Union.
I see. Well, I'll go and have a word with Mr. Cooper then.
After a few minutes' private consultation behind closed doors, both officers returned.
The situation is this: Mr. Vernon Cooper does not wish to be interviewed, and also respects his privacy.
Well, when we were asked to leave before, we did. And this is a public highway.
I know that.
He did originally ask, in fact, demand to be interviewed, and it's been
I'm afraid I don't know anything about this, but he does not wish to be interviewed. He wishes you to respect his privacy.
Well, as long as we're here, we're doing just that, aren't we?
Exactly.
Okay. Thank you, gentlemen.
But as they departed to stand by the gate, the chairman of the ACU Road Racing Committee, who'd been in there all along, made his exit. So vital questions, life and death questions on the safety of this spectacular sport remain, for the moment, unanswered.